Good morning, Mr. Mybeck. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Chairperson.
Yes.
Mr. Chairperson, with your leave, we would like now to switch to the evidence of or dealing with the Manganese expansion project and Hatch.
Yes.
My colleague, Mrs. Siegels-Ngube, will deal with the first witness.
Yes, no, that's fine.
Thank you.
Why is the aircon making such a lot of noise today? Mr. Mybeck, you don't have to stand up where you are. Just mention this for the record. You know, yesterday, at some stage in the afternoon, when we looked at the minutes of the meeting of the 11th of April 2011, I don't think it was the board. I think it was one of the committees. I mentioned that there was something I wanted to raise later, but I forgot about it. I'm just mentioning it so that one can pick it up next time. The minutes that we're looking at reflect that Mr. Gama was acting group CEO at the time. It means within 2 weeks of him us going back to Transnet, he became acting group CEO, but I think it was temporary because it appears that Mr. Brian Mlefe was outside the country, but there may be some significance in that fact, so I just mentioned that. Okay, all right.
Good morning, Chair.
Good morning.
Chair, as Mr. Mybeck indicated, today we will be dealing with the evidence of Transnet's Manganese expansion project and events that occurred during 2013 and 2014 during the procurement process of service providers at the time for the project. Now, just for the benefit of the public, Chair, the Transnet Manganese expansion project was a project to increase Transnet's capacity on its manganese line, rail line, from what it was 5.5 million tons per annum to what would effectively, at the end of the project, be 16 million tons per annum. In 2008, Transnet and the manganese ore mining industry identified the need to increase the capacity because there was an anticipated increase in demand for manganese at the time. The plan was to upgrade the rail network between the Northern Cape and the Eastern Cape at the time, and this would include a new bulk terminal in the Eastern Cape. The project was to include the rail and the port component with a projected cost of 25 billion rand at the time. Mr. Henk Bester, which is the first witness that we're calling today, was at the time the project director of Hatch Goba, which was one of the service providers that was awarded one of the contracts, actually 2 contracts in phase 1 and phase 2. Now, the evidence that we will be leading will center around what happened during the procurement process and the pressure that was placed on Hatch at the time to incorporate some of the service providers identified by Transnet to be its preferred service providers. If, with the leave of the Chair, may I then call Mr. Henk Bester to take the affirmation or oath, Chair?
Yes, thank you. Please administer the oath or affirmation. Please stand up and
remove
put
your
on your mic. Put on your mic. If you are going to be audible with the mask on, that's fine. But if you are not audible, we'll tell you. Okay, all right.
Yeah. I'll take it off, yeah?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Please state your full names for the record.
Hendrik Jacobus Bester.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
Yes?
Do you have any objections to taking the prescribed
No.
oath?
I don't.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
Yes, I do.
Do you swear that the evidence will give it be the truth, the whole truth and nothing else but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you, Mr. Bester. You may be seated. Yes, you may.
Thank you,
proceed.
Chair.
Yes.
Chair, we'll be going through, working through bundle 4A and 4B today.
Yes, okay.
Bundle 4A contains Mr. Bester's statement, and that can be found, Chair, in the second folder, marked BB19,
Yes.
commencing on page 24 of the black numbers, Mr. Bester. Can you go to page 24?
Yeah?
And may I ask you to also go to page 50? If you could also go to page 130. If you can keep page. Yes, Chair.
You have you advised Mr. Bester that you will be looking at the black numbers?
Yes,
when
I
you
have, Chair.
refer
I've
to
just told
pages?
him now, yes.
Okay.
You say to page 130.
Yes, so we'll start on page 24 and page 130. I just want you to identify that the statement is in fact your statement. It's the black numbers. So you'll see that the numbers say Transnet 04025, which is looking at the last
025,
number,
yeah.
which says 25. So page 24. Do you
Yeah.
have that?
Yeah?
And page 130 of the black numbers. The last page of your statement is page 130.
On mine, that the last page of your statement seems to be 52. Have I got something wrong?
It seems so, Chair. I'm looking at, yes, page 52 is the end
bundle.
of the
Just 1 second.
affidavit. Yeah.
Right. The bundle that I have is Transnet Bundle 04A. It's
Yes,
the
Chair.
bundle that starts with Mr. Mkwanazi's affidavit
Correct, Chair.
and Mr. Bester's affidavit or statement, it seems, starts at page 24.
Correct, Chair.
But on mine, it seems to go only up to page 52.
Correct, Chair. I'm referring to inclusive of the annexures.
Oh,
I just
okay.
want to orientate Mr. Bester as to
Okay.
what we'll be dealing with. Mr. Bester, do you have 130? Do you have page 130?
130.
Yes. It'll still be under the same folder. So if you're going to a new blue folder, then you've gone too far. Go on.
130 is blank on mine.
It's a blank, yes. It's a
Yeah.
blank
Blank.
page. Yes,
So
correct.
the last page is
Yeah.
129.
Page 129.
Yeah.
Do you confirm that this is your statement that you provided to the
Yes,
Commission?
I confirm it's my statement, yes.
And then on page 52, do you confirm that that is your signature, page 52?
Yes, I confirm that's my signature.
Chair, with your leave, may Mr. Bester's statement with annexures be admitted as Exhibit BB19?
Yes, just for the sake of completeness, you confirm that the contents of the statement are true and correct
Yes,
to the best of your knowledge and belief.
Chair, I confirm.
You do, okay. You'd like me to admit this statement as exhibit
BB19, Chair, BB19.
BB19.
Correct, Chair.
Okay, all right. I don't want to
Delay.
not pronounce your surname correctly, incorrectly.
Yes, Chair.
Is it pronounced Sengils Ngube?
It's Seagulls Ngube, Chair. Seagulls.
Seagull.
Seagulls.
Seagull. Okay,
Ngube.
all right.
I think the Ngube part is the easy part.
I'm very sensitive about not
Indeed,
pronouncing people's names correctly because I don't like mine not to be
Indeed,
pronounced. So, but if I were to try and write it as I would pronounce it, I would
Then
say S.
SEE,
Yes,
G,
yes,
EE,
yes.
LS.
But in terms of, are the E's pronounced as like A-R or?
C, so the first E's would be C, as in C-E-E, so seagulls. So you could say it's seagulls.
Okay,
So after the
seagulls.
G, you could spell it as a girl, and
Yeah,
you would
okay.
get it.
Okay, all right.
Thank you,
If I
Chair.
mispronounce it, please forgive me. We'll, by the time we finish, I hope I will be able to pronounce it correctly.
Ngube is also just fine, Chair.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The statement by Mr. Henk Bester, which starts at page 24, is admitted and will be marked as exhibit. Is it BB19?
BB19, Chair.
BB19. Okay,
Thank you, Chair.
thank you.
Chair, at some point I will also be referring Mr. Bester to the statements of Mrs. Deidre Strydom, who's a Transnet employee, as well as Mr. Gerard Bierman, who is a former Transnet employee and the former CFO of Transnet Capital Projects. I'm not sure if Chair would want me to identify those statements now for the record, but not have them admitted as yet, since the witnesses haven't yet given evidence.
And let's see when you need to refer to them.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Mr. Bester, can we start on page 24 of the bundle, which is the start of your statement? And I'd like to begin with how you came to be the project director of HGOBA and what it is that HGOBA does, as you deal with from paragraph 5 of your statement on page 25.
I don't know whether your voice is on the soft side.
Okay,
You
Chair.
might wish to raise it
Project
just a
it.
little bit, yeah.
Okay, Chair.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, Chair. If you could just take us through how it came to be that you became the project director of HGOBA and what it is that HGOBA does.
Yeah. Okay, so I started my career, Chair, in 1990 with Transnet, as I had a bursary with them. I worked there for about 8 years. And then I joined a private consulting firm called R&H Railway Consultants, where I became the managing director. And over that next 10 years, we worked a lot for Transnet, projects that we tendered for and were successful for, a lot of studies that we've done. And it was also during that time that we got involved, as they call it, the Manganese line. It's basically the line from the Northern Cape to the port of Port Elizabeth. We did a lot of studies for Transnet, but also for the private sector, looking at options to expand the line, increase the capacity, both for the infrastructure and the rolling stock, as we call it, wagons and locomotives. And in 2008, I joined a global company called Hatch, in South Africa named as Hatch Goba at the time, where I became the global lead for rail, not only looking after South Africa, but also countries like Australia and South America. And it was during that time that we became very much involved with the manganese line, as I call it. We did earlier studies to looking at options of expanding the capacity of the port of Port Elizabeth, where we looked at different ports like Saldanha, Durban, Richards Bay, and also other ports on the west coast of South Africa. And it was during that time that Transnet announced that they're going to expand the manganese line to 16 million tons. And they will be doing a project called the 16 million tons expansion study, manganese expansion project. And that is where I became the project director for the manganese expansion project.
Okay. Now, at paragraph 14 of your statement on page 27, you deal with how TFR approached Hatch. Can you just explain to us what exactly was the manganese expansion project and why was it necessary to expand the rail line?
Yeah. If this in a bigger context, if you understand the manganese industry in the world, South Africa probably sits with about 80% of the world's reserves. But we're only exporting at that time about 6 to 8 million tons of manganese, which was less than 20% of the world demand. So also understanding that South Africa has got some of the best grade manganese in the world, so it was well sought after. So there was a big need for Transnet to expand the capacity of the railway lines, because if you understand the manganese exporting system, most of the mines are located in the Northern Cape, which is about 1,000 kilometers from the coast. So these manganese are transported by Transnet over the railway line from the mines in the Northern Cape to the port of Port Elizabeth. It was also at that time that Transnet announced that they will relocate from the port of Port Elizabeth to the port of Coega, because they wanted to make Port Elizabeth a clean port, and Coega was earmarked for bulk minerals like manganese. So at that time, we were busy with another study for Transnet looking at the immediate options to expand the manganese line. And specifically at the time, if I can recall, there was a study called the 5.5 million tons manganese export study, which I was the project director for, where we looked at the, as we call it, the immediate bottlenecks. It was bottlenecks that we could identify in the very short term that could be expanded to sort of open up the industry for the manganese. And that culminated in a project called the 5.5 million tons manganese export study and project later years. And then after that, Transnet announced that they want to go for the big export expansion project called the 16 million tons manganese study or project. And that is where this whole study came about, to do a feasibility about doing this project, understanding what the tariffs would be, understanding in Transnet case if the business case made sense in terms of all the hurdle rates that they've identified at the time, and then actually going for the execution of that study. So that is where we became involved with the bigger 16 million tons manganese expansion project.
Okay, and then also still on page 27, at paragraph 15, you deal with the fact that phase 1 and phase 2, there was a phase 1 and phase 2 for the manganese expansion project, and that phase 1 was a confinement. Can you explain what that means?
Yes. So during the feasibility of the manganese expansion study, part of the study is to identify and do a detailed cost estimate of what such a project would cost for Transnet. So if I recall at the time, we estimated the project to be in the region of about 27 billion rand. And understanding Transnet cash flow and balance sheet at the time and the ability to fund the project, Transnet decided at the time to split the project into a phase 1 and phase 2 for cash flow reasons and also budget constraint regions. But of course, another reason was to see what they can do as a short-term immediate spending to open up the corridor for the expansion of the Manganese. And for that reason, they decided to split the project into a phase 1, which could be considered a short-term project, and the phase 2, which was a much longer-term project, happened after phase 1.
And why was phase 1 a confinement as opposed to an open tender?
So considering the fact that Hatch was doing the feasibility study at the time, Transnet also identified that to go out onto the open market for a tendering process will consume a lot of time. And also considering the time value of money, they decided it made sense at the time, considering also the knowledge that we had as consultants about the project, to confine the project to Hatch. And then phase 2 would be an open, a public tendering process that they will advertise.
Okay, and you then say in your statement at paragraph 16 that one of the requirements in the confinement request for quotation was a supplier development requirement. Can you just explain to us what is supplier development and what was the requirement from Transnet's side?
Yes. So supplier development, I think now is a well-defined term. At the time, when it happened during those years, it was quite a new concept. And I can also recall our president at the time, Mr. Jacob Zuma, at the State of His Nation address, basically the first time used the word supplier development. And that was introduced where state-owned enterprises like Transnet will have a requirement for that they need to use at least 30% of the contract values need to go towards supplier development. Now, supplier development, as I understand it, and I understand it now, is to capacitate smaller suppliers and consultants in South Africa, to capacitate them in terms of capacity and also capability, and by using the bigger consultants and the bigger suppliers to do that. So it's a requirement that you use these small companies in your bigger contracts for Transnet projects.
Okay, and what was Transnet's requirement in terms of supplier development?
So Transnet's requirement at the time was supposed to be 30%, but we were surprised to see that there was a requirement for 50% in our confinement.
Why did that come as a surprise to you?
Well, as I said, at the time, supplier development was quite a new concept for all of us. And we were, at the time, well aware that there was an announcement by the President that there was a 30% supplier development requirement. So the first time we heard about the 50% is when we got the confinement or the request for quotation with the 50% supplier development requirement in it. So it was quite a surprise to us. You must also understand, in terms of supplier development, is that the main supplier, which was in this case Hatch Goba, would take all the responsibility and liability and professional indemnity for the project. So that means basically doing 50% of the work, but taking 100% of the liability and responsibility for the project, which wasn't acceptable to us at the time.
Okay. Now, on page 28 of your statement, at paragraph 18, you speak of a call that you received on the 19th of July 2013. Can you tell us about this call and what transpired thereafter?
Yes. So it was during this time of confinement and working on this project that I received a call from Mr. Nailan Parayachi that indicated he would like to come and see me. At the time, he just indicated that he would like to come and see me about the Manganese project, and the details were not discussed on the phone.
Did you know Mr. Parayachi?
I didn't know him at all.
Okay. What transpired after that?
So I've agreed that Mr. Parayachi came and see me at the Hatch offices in Woodmead. So Mr. Alain Parayachi brought with him another gentleman, Mr. Dave Reddy, and they came and see me in my office where they told me that we need to include them as part of our supply development into our confinement for Phase 1 Manganese expansion project.
Did you know Mr. Reddy?
I didn't know Mr. Reddy at all.
Do you know the names of, sorry.
Which year are we talking about? Is it 2012 when these activities happened? Mr.
2013.
2013?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And at that meeting, did Mr. Parayachi say from which company he was coming?
Mr. Parayachi was from a company called PM Africa.
And did you know the company? Or
Not at all.
Okay, all right. You may
Thank you,
proceed.
Chair. And Mr. Reddy, what company was he from?
He was from a company called DEC Consultants, if I can recall.
Okay. And when they told you that you had to include them in Hatch's submission for the confinement, did they say how this request came about?
Yes. So they came and see me, if I can say it like this, almost as if they were sent to me. So they indicated that there was a wish from Transnet, and they were sent by number 1, that they need to be part of our supply development component. And that's it. You know, at the meeting we discussed their skills and what is required, and that's it.
And did they say who number 1 was?
They didn't say to me who number 1 was. You know,
Did you ask them? Did you ask them who is number 1?
Yes, I did ask Mr. Dave Reddy who was number 1, and he said, you can figure out who's number 1.
So he didn't want to tell you who number 1 was, but he said you could figure it out yourself.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I recall he said to me, you know who's number 1.
Yes, yes. And that part of the discussion was left at that. The question of who number 1 was left at that.
It was left at that, yes.
Okay, all right. Continue.
Thank you, Chair. And did you have any idea of who number 1 could be?
Well, I mean, obviously at the time, in the media, everybody referred to Mr. Zuma as number 1. But in my world, for Transnet, it was either Mr. Anor Singh or Mr. Brian Molefe that was number 1. So it was between those 3 that I figured out must be number 1.
Okay. And how did the meeting conclude?
Well, we had quite a discussion at the meeting because, as I said, at the time, supply development was quite a new concept for us. You know, we treated very carefully about how we went about our business because, as I said, it was an issue about liability and responsibility and professional indemnity for us because it was quite a large project to execute. I clearly recalled I asked them about the skill sets that they have, and Mr. Reddy indicated to me he's got a lot of engineers in India that can help, and I recall telling him that, you know, supply development is not about growing skills in India, it's a South African initiative.
Okay, and was there anything about them approaching you that concerned you because this was a confinement? Would they know about this confinement? Was it public knowledge?
At the time, it was very concerning because they gave me a lot of facts about the project, which I thought at the time was confidential to Transnet. So they had an intimate knowledge about the project. Even the confinement was not public knowledge. The confinement, and I have to say, the confinement at that time was not confirmed because if you understand the confinement process, it is not concluded until you've signed the contract. And and it was a very closed process within Transnet of the confinement.
Okay. Now, on page 30 of your statement at paragraph 21, you say that upon the conclusion of the meeting, it was agreed that Pariachi would send a memorandum of understanding which Hatch would consider and give an indication of its willingness to use PM Africa and DC as potential partners for SD in the future. How did the topic about a memorandum of understanding come about?
Well, if you understand, our Hatch operates is a global company, so everything needs to be formal and in writing. So I insisted that the discussion that we had must be formalized in writing, and they need to send me a letter. And the best way of doing that at the time was considered, send me a memorandum of understanding of how you see we can work together and your expectations, and then I will take it to the management within Hatch and we will consider it.
Okay, I'll take you to the memorandum in a minute. I just want to continue with paragraph 21. In your statement, you also say that you discussed it with Mr. Alan Gray, who was the managing director at Hatch at the time. Why did you feel the need to discuss the matter with him?
Yeah, he was the managing director for infrastructure, not the managing director for Hatch at the time. Okay. Well, I mean, we had a very transparent system within Hatch where we have to share information about clients and projects on a continuous basis, you know, because we would, as I said, we're dealing with very large projects, we're dealing with clients, sensitive clients like Transnet, and being a global company, you know, there's a platform that we've created where we share between managers information that is put to us. And for that reason, you know, it was best for us to share within Hatch this type of meetings and discussions that we had.
Okay, so then did Mr. Pariachi send the memorandum of understanding?
Yes, he emailed me a MOU.
Okay, can we go to page 71 of...
Well, before
Sorry,
that,
Chair.
you say you had a discussion with Mr. Alan Gray. Tell me about that discussion. What was Mr. Alan Gray's reaction to the meeting that you had had with Mr. Reddy and Mr. Padiachi?
Chair, I didn't hear that question.
You say in paragraph 21, you discussed with Mr. Alan Gray, who was managing director of industrial infrastructure at Hedge, what transpired at the meeting, and you informed him that PM Africa and DEC would send an MOU for Hedge to consider. I take it that that discussion that you are talking about entailed you telling him what had transpired at your meeting with Mr. Padiachi and Mr. Reddy, is that correct?
Yes.
So what was his reaction to you telling him what they had come to say to you?
I discussed with him exactly what transpired at the meeting about the sensitive information that was communicated to me about the project, and he was very uncomfortable about the discussion. Yes, he indicated that to me.
But at that stage, no decision was taken between the two of you as to what to do before the memorandum of understanding would arrive.
No, it was agreed that we will wait for the MOU
Yes.
to understand and see what they communicate to us before we take any actions.
Yes, okay, all right. Okay, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to take you to page 71, which is an annexure to your statement, the black numbers. And at the foot of the page, there's an email. Is that the email that Mr. Padiachi sent to you with the MOU?
Yeah, this is, you will see at the bottom of the page, it says from Nayland Padiachi to Henk Bester, and he copied Mr. Dave Reddy. It was sent on the 25th of July, 5 to 2 in the afternoon.
What does it say?
It says, "Hi Henk. Thank you for the meeting on Monday, the 22nd of July 2013, 07:25. We attach for your attention and comment the promised MOU. Please advise on your comments and or input so we can finalize ASAP. Regards, Nylan Parayachi."
Okay.
For and on behalf of PM Africa Project Management.
Okay, then on page 74 to page 76, can you identify what that document is?
Yes, so on page 74 is the actual Memorandum of Understanding that was sent to me.
Okay, and what was your reaction to the memorandum? And if you can just take us through your understanding of its contents at the time. Your mic is off.
Apologies. I received the MOU, I read through it, and then I sent it on to Mr. Alan Gray. And so this is the MOU that we received from PM Africa, the gentleman that came and see me. Obviously, at the time when we read through it, we were both uncomfortable with it.
Why were you uncomfortable with its terms?
Maybe before that, you might wish to ask him to identify the main features of the memorandum
Thank you, Chair.
that attracted his attention at the time he read it and how he felt about them.
Yeah. If you can just take us through the main features of the MOU that drew your attention and what your reaction was to that and your understanding.
Yeah, so the MOU states the overview, which is basically the two companies, Development and Engineering Consultants, referred to as DEC, and PM Africa, referred to as PMA, form an unincorporated JV, in short referred to as DEC PMI JV, between the two companies. And then HATS on the other side, HATS Goba, here referred to as HATS, is a project management and consulting engineering services company with the address. And then they go further into the scope. This is to facilitate a close working relationship based on an enterprise development and or supplier development initiative between both entities, whilst delivering multidisciplinary engineering design and project management solutions for the South African market within the rail engineering, transportation and infrastructure engineering sectors on an EPCM basis. Okay. Then it goes further into a non-compete, which is a standard clause in an MOU, liabilities, dispute resolution law, and then the signature requirements.
Okay, if you can just go to page 76 and just identify the parties to the MOU.
So the parties at the bottom on the signatures, HATS Goba Africa, is myself, Henk Bester, designation Global Director Rail. And on the other side, Development and Engineering Consultants. The name is Devlin Lutzeman Reddy, designation CEO.
And PM Africa?
And PM Africa, at the bottom, name Mr. Nylan Parayachi, designation CEO.
Okay, now the MOU doesn't specifically mention Transnet or the Manganese expansion project. So what was it about the MOU? Because on the face of it, it seems quite innocuous. What was it about it that made you uncomfortable, you and Mr. Gray?
I think exactly as you've said it, what made us uncomfortable, it was a very loose arrangement. At the time we felt it is too loose, it needs to be specific, because it can create impression, all sorts of impressions that we don't want. We need to firm up on it and make it very specific.
If you were going to make it specific, what would you as Hatch have expected to include in it?
As a minimum, it would have included the scope of works, and the roles and responsibility, exclusivity or not, duration, liabilities, and you know, this is not a Hatch standard MOU that was in front of me. It came from Mr. Pariachi and Mr. Reddy, so it was too loose for us.
Okay, on page 31 of your statement,
On page?
31, at paragraph 23, after receiving the MOU, you then refer to a meeting at paragraph 23 on page 31. Do you have it? Do you have it, Mr. Bester?
Yeah, I have it.
You refer there to a meeting that you had with Mr. Rudi Basson of Transnet Capital Projects. Why did you have a meeting with him?
So if you understand how the projects are executed,
I'm sorry, just to make sure it connects properly. After you received the memorandum, you noted certain features, you had certain concerns, but then you shared it with Mr. Gray, is that right?
that's correct.
Yeah, and Mr. Gray shared your concerns about it?
Yes, I can
You had
remember
the
at the
same concerns?
I sent him the email with the MOU. At the time, I think he was in Cape Town, I was in Johannesburg, and he said he will peruse the document, make some comments and send it back to me. And then we need to discuss it. But we did have a phone discussion where we both agreed we cannot sign this document.
Yes. Before the next meeting, was there another opportunity for the two of you to discuss further the MOU? You and Mr. Gray?
Yes, we did discuss it,
You
yes.
did have another discussion.
Yeah.
And confirming the same concerns? The meeting, the second discussion, did it basically confirm the same concerns, and did it deal with the question of how you were going to respond?
Yes, so Mr. Gray and myself had a discussion. We've agreed how we're going to respond. And it was agreed that I will send an email back to the two gentlemen.
Yes.
And put our concerns in writing.
Okay, all right, take it from there.
Thank you, Chair. So prior to you sending your email to Mr. Pariachi and Mr. Reddy, you then have a meeting with Mr. Rudi Basson on the 26th of July. Why did you have that meeting with him?
Well, Mr. Rudi Basson was the project director on the capital project side for Transnet. So it would have come out in a discussion between myself and Mr. Gray that we decided we're going to share with Mr. Rudi Basson the meeting that we had, and that we felt uncomfortable about the information that was shared with us about the project and from Transnet, and we were looking towards him for his advice.
Okay. And at that meeting, Ms. Deidre Strydom was present as well?
That's correct.
Okay. What did Mr. Basson say in that meeting?
Mr. Basson was surprised that we had a visit because he knew about the two gentlemen. He indicated that Mr. Singh spoke to him and Mr. Bierman about these two gentlemen.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let's tackle the meetings differently. I want to hear the arrangements for the meeting. Who was at the meeting? When was the meeting? What was the issue to be discussed? What was discussed? Who said what? I would like it that way.
Thank you, Chair.
So, was this meeting with Mr. Passon the one on the 26th of July? Is it 26th July?
The 26th of July 2013 it was a
Yes.
meeting with Mr. Rudi Basson, yes.
Yes. I think you had covered this, but go back to how that meeting came about, and then tell me who was present, what was discussed, and then what was concluded, what was the conclusion.
Chair, I was not, the meeting could have come about where I either discussed it with Mrs. Deidre Strydom at the time, who was the project director for Transnet Freight Rail for the project, and she suggested I need to see Mr. Rudi Basson, or I would have phoned Mr. Rudi Basson myself and said to him, I need to see him urgently about a discussion I had with two gentlemen that had confidential information about Transnet and the project. So I set that meeting up.
And when you set the meeting up, would this have been before you could respond to Mr. Padiachi, or would it have been before you could respond?
That was before we responded to Mr. Pariachi, because
Yes.
we were also looking to Mr. Basson for advice.
Yes, okay. So you didn't respond to Mr. Padiachi until after that meeting?
That's correct.
Okay, all right. Take it from there.
Thank you, Chair. So at the meeting, it's yourself, Mr. Basson, and Ms. Strydom.
That's correct.
And as the Chair indicated, what was discussed at the meeting?
So at the meeting, I gave Mr. Basson a full briefing of what transpired at the meeting, my meeting with Mr. Pariachi and Mr. Dave Reddy. I told him about the information that was shared to us. I told him about what their requirement was to work with us. Obviously, I also told him about number one. And Mr. Basson indicated to me that he knew about these two gentlemen because he was informed about these two gentlemen by Mr. Anos Singh, him and Mr. Gerrit Bierman. And he was surprised that they came and see us. That was his words.
Well, when you say they were informed by Mr. Anuj Singh, what exactly did Mr. Singh say to Mr. Basson and Mr. Bierman, according to what Mr. Basson told you?
If I can recall what was said at the meeting by Mr. Basson at the time is that Mr. Anos Singh indicated that he want a specific company to be included as our supplier development company for the Manganese expansion project, and he mentioned the names of these two gentlemen.
Okay, and what was Mr. Basson and Mr. Bierman's reaction to that, according to what Mr. Basson told you?
At the time, at that specific meeting, I told him that, you know, what is happening within Hatch, that we're not going to sign the MOU. Obviously, as a global company, this is not the way we do business. And at the time, I can recall Mr. Basson said to me, leave it to me. And I think at the time, my understanding was he will speak to either Mr. Anos Singh or Mr. Gerrit Bierman to come back to me on advice.
Well, I just want to go a step back. You were answering a different question. My question was, what did Mr. Basson tell you Mr. Anuj Singh had said to them about DC and PM Africa, which you answered. Then as a follow-up, I asked, what was Mr. Basson and Mr. Bierman's response to Mr. Singh in that meeting that they had with Mr. Singh, according to what Mr. Basson told you?
Yes, so Mr. Basson indicated to me that both him and Mr. Bierman advised Mr. Anos Singh it's not advisable to do that, to include or to indicate to us which companies to include as our supply development companies.
Okay. In your experience, has Transnet ever required Hatch on a formal basis to include a specific subcontractor in its contract?
No.
So,
What Mr. Basson told you, was it that Mr. Singh had shared with him and with somebody else that he would like your company to include Mr. Padachi's company and Mr. Reddy's company as supplier development companies in the project? Is that what you were told?
That's correct.
Yes, and Mr. Basson said they told Mr. Singh that that's not a good idea.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
That's correct.
Okay.
thank you, Chair. Now, what then transpired further at the meeting after Mr. Basson said to you that he's aware of this and he's quite surprised that they would approach you directly?
Well, I can remember that we concluded the meeting, and it must have been later that same day where Mr. Basson, remember I said at the meeting that he will speak to Mr. Anos Singh or Mr. Gerrit Bierman and come back to me on advice. It must have been later that day that he came back and said to me, something to the effect of just sign the damn thing.
Sign the damn thing, meaning sign the MOU.
That's correct.
Now, what was, just to go back to the meeting, what, prior to you getting the call, what was Ms. Strydom's advice to you as to what to do with the MOU?
Mr. Strydom said to me at the time, please don't sign this thing. Please don't sign the MOU.
Okay. And Mr. Basson in the meeting, what did he say you should do?
Not at the meeting, but on a phone call to me later that day, he
Yeah.
said to me, just sign the damn thing.
Yeah, I understand that that's what he said after the call, but at the meeting when Ms. Strydom is present, what is he saying to you should do?
He indicated that he said to me, don't sign it, because him and Mr. Bierman advised Mr. Anna Singh not to do it like that, and in his words, not to nominate a supply development company to Hatch. So his advice was not to sign it.
Okay. And so later that day, he then says, sign the damn thing.
Later that day, he phoned us and said, just sign the damn thing.
And did you sign?
What was
Sorry,
your
Chair.
reaction to this new development?
My reaction
On the
was,
phone.
as Hatch, we had no intention of signing that. So I was just confused about the messages that I got from Transnet.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Did you sign the MOU as directed by
No,
Mr.
we
Basson?
didn't.
Sorry?
We didn't sign the MOU.
Okay, what did you do with the MOU?
So as I indicated, I emailed the MOU to Mr. Alan Gray, who at the time, as I said, was in Cape Town, I think. He made some changes and he emailed it back to me as a suggested rewording of the MOU that was sent to us.
So he amended the MOU.
That's correct.
Okay. Can we just go to page 32 of your statement at paragraph 25? That's where you deal with Mr. Gray having amended the MOU.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
If we can then just go to the amended MOU, which is HB4, my apologies, and that is on page 78, which is the annexes. We first deal with the email and then the amended MOU. If you can go to page 78. At the foot of the page, so that's also on the 26th.
Yes.
When Mr. Alan Gray sends you an email at the foot of the page. Do you see that?
I can see, yeah.
Can you just read, and it follows on the next page, can you just read what it says?
So this email is from Mr. Alan Gray to Hilary Cook, which was his secretary, and he copied me, Henk Bester. Subject MOU agreement. Hi. Been on this for the past hour or so. Please print this. Remember, this is a message to his secretary, and he copied me.
Yeah.
Please print this with changes shown, and then go through and check and accept any changes, and accept my changes in the updated MOU. Henk needs to check through and make sure he is happy with it. And then the last paragraph is addressed to me, Henk. Henk, they need to get the message somehow that they are not the only ST contractor, nor do they have first choice / shot at any project that we are pursuing. Hope this wording is not so vague that they are now not happy. Alan Gray, Managing Director, Industrial Infrastructure.
Okay, and then on page 81 to page 83, can you identify what this document is?
Yes, this is the revised MOU.
That you received from Mr. Alan Gray?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, can you, as the chair asked earlier on with the first MOU, identify any key features that you wanted to highlight to Pariachi and Reddy about how you wanted to operate with them going forward?
Yes, I can.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Chair.
In doing so, please also tell me what changes Mr. Gray made on the email that you had sent him, which had come from Mr. Padachi. Important changes or amendments that he made.
Yes, so I think the important changes were, if you look on this, the company details remain the same. And the changes would come into, if I can read this, DEC, PMA, JV and Hatch have agreed to enter into this Memorandum of Understanding for the express purpose of cooperating where applicable on an enterprise development basis and for specified supply development initiatives related to engineering and project management services. This shall be on a specifically agreed project-by-project basis and on a non-exclusive basis. The parties shall engage of their own free will for the mutual benefit of both parties and hereby agree to honour and be bound by the following terms and conditions. So that sentence is the big difference. It will be on a non-exclusive basis and the parties shall be agreed by their own free will participate on the project.
Okay, continue. Also in respect of the period that it would be operational.
Yeah, so it will be on a yearly basis, renewable on a yearly basis, renewed on a yearly basis.
Okay. Were there any other changes that were made?
No other changes were made.
Okay. And is that your signature on
Oh,
page?
excuse me. Yeah,
yeah.
apologies.
No, that's fine.
So the other change that was made should, and if I can refer you to page 82 on the top,
Yeah.
it says, should a project materialize, it shall be executed on the basis whereby DCA, PMV, JV, which is the companies from Mr. Reddy and Pariachi, shall act as subconsultants to Hatch Goba on agreed scope, price, and terms and conditions, which shall be finalized prior to either bidding for or commencement of the project.
Okay, can you explain the significance of that change?
Yes, so the significance of that change is that it's on a subconsultant basis, which means it's no expectations that it will be a joint venture or 50-50 partnership or any other type of contract. And then, of course, it will be on an agreed scope, price, and terms and conditions.
Okay. And did you send this amended Memorandum of Understanding to Pariachi and Reddy?
Yes, I did.
Okay, if we can just go to the email that you addressed to them. It's on page 85 of the bundle. At the foot of the page, which is still the same day.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you just read the email for us?
So, the email is from Henk Bester, sent 26 July 2013, 11:35 in the morning, to Mr. Nailan Pariachi, and I copied Mr. Dave Reddy. Subject, REDEC PMA JV MOU.
Okay, continue.
And then I said, guys, please find attached the signed MOU, which I signed on behalf of Hatch Goba. Please note we have made some changes in, and then I numbered it 3 changes. MOU for 1 year renewable, obviously as per project. Non-exclusive in that we will also use other companies as see fit to satisfy HD requirements. And point number 3, it will be in the form of a subconsultant agreement with scope, SD targets, etc., etc. Please advise if happy, as our intent is commitment to SD. Regards, Henk Bester.
Okay. And what was their reaction to the amended MOU?
I can recall that they were not happy.
Okay. On page 33 of your statement, at paragraph 29,
Paragraph.
29
Yeah.
at the foot of the page. You speak of a call that you received from Mr. Pariachi on the 1st of August 2013, where he requested for you to meet up with him again, and you agreed to meet on the 5th of August 2015. Can you take us through what happened at that meeting of the 5th of August 2013? And as the chair indicated, if you can tell us who was present at the meeting and what each person contributed to the meeting and what was discussed.
So yes, I received a call and they would like to meet me again. It was agreed on the 5th of August. At the meeting, they advised me that the confinement process was imminent, but they will send me an addendum to the MOU that we have sent to them. They indicated that the MOU as in its current form is not acceptable.
Now, what did you understand by them having mentioned that the confinement is imminent?
Well, at the time, as I understood it, was that they indicated to me that the confinement is imminent, subject to there is another matter that we need to conclude.
The other matter being?
They need to change the MOU to us, and we need to agree on a revised MOU.
So your understanding is that the confinement, that was the only thing that was holding up the award of the confinement by Transnet to Hatch. Is that correct?
That's correct. In my own world, I understood it that we being held ransom. Transnet is not going to approve the confinement unless we agree to the revised MOU.
Okay, and so when you refer to revised MOU, you're referring to the addendum that Mr. Pariachi and Reddy gave to you at this meeting?
I can't recall if they actually gave it to me at the meeting or they emailed it to me after the meeting.
Okay, but you're referring to the addendum
That's
when you say
correct.
revised, because we have the initial MOU, then we have the Hatch revised MOU, and then we have the addendum.
That's correct, Jim.
Okay, and you then received the addendum from them?
I did receive by email I received the addendum, yes.
Okay, can we go to the addendum? That is to be found on page 89 of the bundle, 89. Do you confirm that that's the addendum that you received from Mr. Pariachi and Mr. Reddy?
I confirm this is the addendum, yes.
Okay. Can you read the addendum for us, please?
The addendum is dated the 2nd of August 2013. Addendum 1 as a heading. It says projects. This addendum refers to the above MOU between Hatch Goba and DEC PMA JV. And then paragraph. The first project identified that the parties will engage on within the purposes and scope of the MOU is recorded as the Transnet EPCM FER34 for the Manganese line upgrade. Hatch Goba will engage DEC PMA JV as the primary SD partner in the project.
Okay, so here for the first time we now see that the Manganese project is specifically mentioned by them.
That's correct.
What was your reaction when you received this addendum, and what did you do with the addendum?
Well, what made our hair stand up?
I'm sorry, Mr. Bester, maybe before that, did this addendum come alone or did it come with the MOU that you had sent to them? And if so, was the MOU that you had sent to them unamended by them?
Chair, I understood that this addendum came on its own without the addendum that we proposed to them.
Yes. at that stage, had they indicated what their attitude was, that is now Mr. Padachi and Mr. Reddy, to the revised memorandum that you sent to them? Had they indicated to you, prior to you receiving this addendum, what their attitude was to the amendments that you had made?
Yes, I can recall that they indicated that they were not happy because they needed to be part of the Manganese Phase 1 project, and it needs to be clearly articulated in the MOU.
Yes. Now, is the position that the MOU that you sent to them did not articulate that? It was general,
That's correct.
and they wanted a specific reference to this particular project.
That's correct.
Did that appear to be their only issue?
No, the other issue was also the non-exclusive basis.
Okay.
They wanted to be included on an
exclusive.
exclusive basis.
Yes, okay. At that stage, your stance remained the same, namely that you didn't want it on an exclusive basis.
No, yes.
Yes,
Our stance
okay.
stayed the same. That's correct.
Okay, so when you received this addendum, what was your reaction to the content of the addendum? Did you think it seemed to be fine, or there was a problem?
Well, I had two reactions. I was very upset because it was clearly stated in this addendum by them that they want to be included as a primary SD partner, which was absolutely the priority point that we highlighted to them we will not sign for. And then also they indicated the FER3/4 Manganese project, which was a very loose description of the Manganese expansion projects of Transnet in general. It doesn't refer to the specific project that we were talking about. Yes. In this case, the 60 million tons Manganese expansion project. This was a very loose term that they used.
So it seemed to be much wider.
Much wider, yes.
Yes, okay.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Bester, at this stage, you have already had the meeting with Mr. Basson, where he told you what him and Mr. Bierman had told Mr. Singh about the fact that they cannot do it, Transnet can't dictate. At any stage after that meeting, and when you met with Mr. Padiachi and Reddy, did you say to them, I had a meeting with Transnet, and they say that this matter is closed. They told Singh that this can't happen.
To be honest, I can't recall sharing that type of detail with them. I can't recall it was actually necessary to share that information with them.
Okay, so you never told them what you were told by Transnet via Mr. Basson?
No. At the time, I wouldn't have thought necessary to share that type of detail with them.
Okay, thank you. Chair, I see that it is 11:15. Is this a convenient time?
Yes, let's take the tea adjournment. We'll resume at 11:30.
Thank you,
We
Chair.
adjourn. Okay, let's continue.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Bester, can you... Mr. Bester, just before the adjournment, we had dealt with the Addendum 1 that you received from Mr. Padiachi and Mr. Reddy. We were at the point where we were dealing with what your reaction was to it and what you did with the addendum.
So, yes, we were not, myself and Mr. Gray, I immediately discussed it with Mr. Gray at Hatch. I'm very unhappy about the situation that was now unfolding. And later that evening, I also phoned Mrs. Deidre Strydom from Transnet Freight Rail, who was the project manager for the Manganese expansion project. I told her about how the events unfolded, and we were now looking towards Transnet for direction of what we need to do.
Can I just ask, why didn't you ask Mr. Basson, who told you to sign the initial MOU, what had transpired? Why Ms. Strydom and not Mr. Basson?
Can you just repeat that question?
Why did you feel it appropriate to approach Mrs. Strydom to tell her what had transpired with the addendum, and not Mr. Basson, who was the person that told you to sign the initial MOU?
It was purely a matter of the reporting system within the project that was set up. So I had more and easier access to the project director and project manager from Transnet Freight Rail than from Transnet Capital Projects. So for that reason, I escalated the matter to her as my sort of direct client interface.
And what was her response?
She indicated to me that she will come back to me on what to do next, and she will also look for some advice within people that she knows within Transnet of what we need to do next.
Okay, at paragraph 31 of your statement on page 34, are you there?
Yes?
You say that at this stage you were very fearful that physical harm would come to you and to other executives at Hatch. What gave you that impression? Sorry, Chair.
It's better to ask the question differently. It's an important question. How did you feel about this whole thing that was happening at that stage?
I can clearly remember at that stage it was a very uncomfortable situation.
Did you have any fears?
Yes.
What fears did you have?
I had fear of physical harm that was going to be imposed upon myself because of just the tone of the meetings that took place and our conversations by phone. And for me, it was an indication that I should be very careful.
Yes, okay, all right. So, because it's an important part, be careful about leading.
Thank you, Chair.
Leading him, yeah. Let him just tell the story.
Now, on page 35 of your statement, which is a continuation of paragraph 31, you deal with Mr. Reddy again referring to number 1. What was the context of that?
Sorry, can you just repeat that?
Page 31 and
Yes.
page 35. It's
Yeah.
a continuation of paragraph 31 of your statement. You again reference Mr. Reddy referring to number 1 was not happy. How did that come about that he said to you that number 1 was not happy?
Well, I phoned Mr. Reddy and I indicated to him that we will not sign the MOU, at least the revised MOU that they sent to us. And then he indicated to me that number 1 will not be happy with this development.
And what did you say in response to that? What did you say to him in response to?
I said to him, I cannot clearly remember exactly what my words would have been, but something to the, in the direction of that is our final decision. And,
Yes.
we cannot care if number 1 is happy or not.
Okay, please continue.
Thank you, Chair. And at paragraph 33, You again refer to a call that Mr. Reddy made to you and an email that you and Mr. Gray prepared to respond to Mr. Pariachi and Mr. Reddy. Can you just take us through how that came about and what the email was contained?
Yes. Apologies. So remember, I phoned Mr. Reddy in the morning. I indicated to him that we will not sign the MOU. And I indicated, and it was during this conversation that he said to me that number one would not be happy, which I indicated to him that's our final decision. But I did indicate to him that obviously it's very important for us to make this formal, and that we will be sending him an email to reflect exactly our decision, which we did.
Okay, if we can go to page 92 of the bundle.
Yeah?
Can you identify this document?
Yes, that is the email I sent to Mr. Pariachi.
And can you read to us what you say in the email?
Yes, it's an email from myself, Henk Bester, sent Wednesday the 7th of August, 6:15 in the evening, to both Mr. Nylan Pariachi and Mr. Dave Reddy. The subject is Addendum 1 to MOU. Dear Nylan and Dave, further to my telephone conversation yesterday evening with Dave, in brackets, I wish to confirm that we are not comfortable signing the Addendum 1 to our MOU which you gave to us for consideration on Monday the 5th, which would confirm the DEC PMA JV as the primary SD partner for the Transnet FER3/4 phases of the Manganese upgrade project. As you seem to be aware, the EPCM appointment for the project had at this stage not been awarded to us and may yet go out to tender should the confinement not be approved. A SD plan, Supplier Development Plan, still needs to be finalized around the specific requirements set for the project and needs to embody all of the various aspects of SD in the broader definition. We have other organizations who will also need to be considered in a transparent manner as appropriate in the rollout of the SD plan, which will require client alignment, Transnet, and endorsement prior to implementation. The MOU recently signed with yourself does not cater for exclusivity. As I've explained to you in our first meeting, Hatch as a global company has fully embraced the principles of SD and will ensure through the project that should we be successful in any other project, we maximize opportunities for skills development, localization, technology transfer, and other targets set to support Transnet in its SD targets as a state-owned company. We are therefore not in a position to agree to your appointment as the primary SD supplier for this project. Thank you for your understanding in this matter. Regards, Henk Bester.
Did you receive a response to this email?
I had several calls from Mr. Dave Reddy, which I didn't answer.
But no written correspondence from him after that?
No.
Okay, now on page 36 of your statement, at paragraph 34, you speak about a meeting on the morning of the 7th of August. This would have been before you sent the email that we've just looked at. You had a meeting with Mr. Gray and with Ms. Strydom. Can you explain to us how that meeting came about and what transpired at that meeting?
Yes, so when we received the Addendum 1 to the MOU from Mr. Reddy and Pariachi, obviously there was a discussion within Hatch, and it was decided that we will have a meeting with Mrs. Deidre Strydom and inform her about how unhappy we are, the situation that we find ourselves in, and we're looking towards her for some advice on what we need to do next and to whom we should escalate this matter within Transnet.
And what did Ms. Strydom do?
At the time, I understood from her that she has spoken to Mr. Johan Bauer, which was also a senior person within Transnet. At the time, I cannot 100% recall his designation. Also to look towards advice from his side. But then I also understand that she said she will speak to Ms. Cleopatra Sisheka, which was the counsel within Transnet, working as a general manager within the office of Mr. Siyabonga Gama.
Okay, and are you aware of whether she did speak to Ms. Shicheka?
Yes, in fact she did, and she advised us that Mr. Sisheka would like to see us for a meeting, which was set up, if I can recall, in the Wimpy and the Carlton Centre.
Okay, and can you explain to us what transpired at that meeting and who was present at the meeting?
Yes, so myself, Mr. Alan Gray, Mrs. Deidre Strydom, we met Miss, I'm not sure if it was Mrs. or Miss, Cleopatra Sisheka at the Wimpy in the Carlton Centre. We told her everything, what transpired to date with the Mr. Dave Reddy and Nailen Parayachi. We explained all the MOUs, the revisions, and at the time also why we didn't feel comfortable signing it. And now we're looking for some advice from herself and people within Transnet of what we should do, and to whom within Transnet we should escalate this matter.
And what did Ms. Shicheka say?
If I can recall what happened at the meeting is she took, we would have taken hard copies of documentation like the MOU to the meeting. She had her iPad there with her and she took pictures of all the MOUs and she requested that we send her an email to a private email. It was a Gmail account. Of exactly what transpired with all the details of the individuals involved. And then we should not do anything further, we should leave it with her.
And did you do as she requested you to do, to send the statement to her private email?
Yes, we did send the email to her private email.
Okay. Do you know what came of this matter?
I don't know. I didn't have direct access to Ms. Cleopatra Sisheka, so I was inquiring through Mrs. Deidre Strydom about feedback. And the feedback I got at the time was Mrs. Cleopatra Sisheka indicated to Mrs. Strydom that told Hatch everything is resolved, they shouldn't do anything further.
Sorry, she said that tell Hatch that the matter is resolved and you shouldn't do anything further.
We shouldn't do anything further.
Okay, and after that, were there any further discussions with Mr. Reddy and Mr. Pariachi?
No.
Okay. Now, we know that in August 2013, the confinement was approved. Is that correct?
Yes, so ultimately the confinement was approved, yes.
Okay, so I would like to take you to your statement where you deal with the tender submission that then took place following the confinement award. Can you just tell us why there was a need for the submission of a tender?
Yes, so the confinement process is we do need to submit a formal, let's call it a tender. So Transnet would issue to us what they call a request for quotation with the detailed scope of work, which we need to price as if it is a formal tender, complete with the conditions of tender attached to that, all the Transnet conditions within, and then there was a deadline set for that as per a formal tendering process. And we would have submitted the tender and before the deadline stated by Transnet.
Okay. At page 38 of your statement, paragraph 41, you speak about a tender declaration form that was part of the tender document. Can you just tell us what the tender declaration form was?
Yes. So It is standard practice for Transnet to include in the tender documentation a tender declaration form, basically indicating that, we were not approached by Transnet personnel during the tendering process, or we were not influenced by Transnet people at the time for awarding this contract. So that obviously for us, it was a serious matter at the time, needed to understand the legal implications for us to sign it or not. And that was a matter that was referred within Hatch to our legal counsel to understand the legality of that specific document.
And what was Hatch's approach in response to the questions contained in the tender declaration form, and specifically related to what had transpired with Pariachi and Reddy?
If I can recall at this stage, our legal counsel at Hatch in South Africa was Mrs. Zandra Blacklaws. So we handed that matter over to her. She looked at it from a perspective of what is required to be signed and what transpired to that date. We also had a meeting with our managing director of Hatch in South Africa at the time, Mr. Rory Kirk, where this whole matter was discussed, and it was founded that we can actually sign a declaration because we were not in conflict of interest, as stated in that specific declaration.
Okay, so if we can go to paragraph 42, here you say, it's on page 39, to the best of my recollection, Hatch's position was the following. And as I understand it, this was Hatch's position vis-a-vis the tender declaration form. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so you set out at the first four sub-paragraphs there that Hatch had acted correctly during the process, and that Pariachi and Reddy's behavior is a cause for concern and warranted the elevation of the matter to Transnet. What I would like to ask you about is on the next page, on page 40, at paragraph 42.7. Where you state in your statement, any influence Pariachi and Reddy claim to have had with Transnet regarding the award of the contract appears to have had no basis, especially in view of the fact that the confinement had been approved without Hatch having to conclude the MOU as Pariachi and Reddy's terms, on Pariachi and Reddy's terms. My question, Mr. Bester, is how could you think that there had been no basis when Basson had told you that Singh specifically told him and Gerard Beerman that he wanted DEC to be a preferred SD partner on this project?
Yeah, you must remember that all the discussions and the feedback we had from the Transnet employees was not in writing. It was verbally communicated to us, and even in our insistence to give us something in writing to nominate a subcontractor, nobody was prepared to do so. So on that basis, considering the fact that we actually then did receive the confinement request for quotation, we came to the conclusion, they probably did not have the standing within Transnet as they indicated.
So was it your basis that as long as it wasn't on paper, they didn't really have any influence? Because it is quite evident that Mr. Basson told you that Mr. Singh had given a direction as to what he wanted to happen. When Mr. Reddy and Pariachi meet with you, they basically tell you the same thing, that they've been sent by people high up and you must make them the SD partner on this project. So it is just, from my side, a bit peculiar that Hatch would take the approach that that they didn't have any influence. I'm just trying to understand what specifically are you referring to as being the influence? How do you understand influence to be?
What was important for us at this stage from the Hatch perspective is that none of the individuals that approached us actually had an influence in how we actually determined the price for our submission. So how we determined the price and eventually came to the conclusion of the supply development percentages was a pure Hatch assessment and calculation. We were not influenced by anybody outside Hatch to change or amend the percentages or make other amounts. So based on that, we were happy that we were not influenced and impacted by somebody else outside Transnet.
Okay, so that was your understanding of
That's
what
correct.
the requirement was from the tender
That's
document?
correct.
Did it not require you to disclose if somebody within Transnet had done something or seemed to be doing something wrong in connection with this project, and you're getting it or not getting it?
Chair, if I understand you correctly, there was no doubt in our mind that there was a lot of, I don't know what the correct word is for that, but
If what you had been told was true about Mr. Singh,
yes,
then
there was
he
a lot
he
of,
was doing something.
no doubt in our mind that there was a lot of things happening behind the scene that we could not put our finger on. But from the actions that we took from a Hatch perspective was purely our decisions. And if you ask me another question, remember we also had a meeting with Mr. Gary Peter,
Yes.
where we insisted that they put whatever they want to do in writing, and he was the procurement lead of Transnet at the time.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, Mr. Bester, at paragraph 46 of your statement on page 41,
Yes,
you speak about various meetings between Hatch and Reddy even after the confinement was awarded. And you say that it culminated in a meeting with the Chief Procurement Officer at Transnet, Mr. Gary Peter. Can you explain to us what Mr. Peter's involvement was in this matter, how the meeting came about, and what transpired at that meeting?
yes. So, subsequent to our formal regret email letter that we sent to Mr. Reddy about not signing the MOU, there was various attempts by Mr. Reddy to contact us, and there were various discussions with him where he tried to influence us to sign the agreement with them. So the decision within Hatch, and that culminated in a meeting with Mr. Gary Peter. In fact, we were invited to a meeting with Mr. Singh, not Gary Peter. It happened that we have seen Mr. Gary Peter, but the meeting was actually set up by Mr. Singh in the Carlton Centre.
Okay, and what transpired at that meeting? And who was present at the meeting?
So we were invited to a meeting with Mr. Singh in the Carlton Centre. I can clearly remember that. Myself and Mr. Alan Gray from Hatch went to this meeting. I can't recall the time of day. It was somewhere in the afternoon.
Sorry, Mr. Bester, can I just interrupt you to maybe give you some direction on the timing? If you go to page 121 of the bundle, you have provided us with a meeting invite.
Yeah.
Is this in respect of that meeting?
That's correct.
Okay, can you just say what the meeting is about? Subject and location.
It says subject.
And I'm sorry, the date,
Sorry.
the intended date of the meeting was to be what date?
22nd of October 2013.
Okay, all right. Yeah, when it comes to meetings, I
Yes,
want to
Chair.
know when, who was there, what was discussed, who said what was the conclusion?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, all right.
So this meeting, invite came from Mr. Gary Peter, to Gary Peter, Melody Batoya, I never know that person, Mr. Anos Singh, Carol Piri, and the subject was discussion with Alan Gray from Hatch. The date of the meeting was the 22nd of October 2013. 1:15 in the afternoon to 2:15, 1:45, it was scheduled in the afternoon. Where? Anas' office. They would have been in the Carlton Centre.
Okay, continue with what the chair asked you. Who was at the meeting? What was the meeting about?
So,
What transpired?
myself and Mr. Alan Gray from Hatch went to this meeting. As I said, I can clearly recall this meeting. It was on the top floor of the Carlton Centre. We were told to wait at reception for Mr. Singh, as he was busy. So, Mr. Gray and myself were sitting at reception waiting for Mr. Singh. His office was open and we could see him sitting inside the office, very casually. People were coming and going out of his office. You know, we were now been waiting for an hour or so for the meeting to start, so we were already an hour overdue. We were very annoyed. We were seeing him walking in and out of his office, talking casually to people, going to the bathroom past us without acknowledging us. So we find it very strange, the situation that we were in. Myself and Mr. Gray sitting in front of his office, waiting for him at the meeting that he scheduled and treating us like that.
Okay, and what transpired at the actual meeting?
So eventually, I think it was after an hour or so, Mr. Gary Peter came to us and said, sorry, Mr. Anas Singh is not available to see us. Mr. Anas Singh asked that he, Mr. Gary Peter himself, see us. So at the meeting was Mr. Gary Peter, myself and Mr. Alan Gray from Hatch. So what transpired at the meeting is that we told Mr. Peter everything, what transpired to date about the gentlemen, Mr. Reddy and Pariachi, their requirement that they had that we must include them. And it was a very heated discussion that we had with Mr. Peter at the time. I can remember, you know, we were insistent that if it is indeed Transnet wanting us to include these gentlemen or these companies in our submission, they need to do it in writing. And we will not act in verbal communication or indirect communication. I can remember Mr. Peter was very aggressive at one stage, and he was even leaning over the table towards me at some stage in a very aggressive nature.
What was Mr. Peter saying? What were his exact words, if you can remember?
It was something to the effect of, I must do as he tells me. And he will not put it in writing, and I will act to what he's telling me.
And what was he telling you to do?
He was telling me to include the gentlemen in our submission.
By the gentleman, you mean?
Mr. Dave Reddy and Helen Pariachi, the two companies.
Okay.
Just for the transcribers, the reference to Mr. Peter is the reference to Mr. Gary Peter, I think. Is that right?
Mr. Gary Peter.
Yes, and Peter is P-I-T-A for the transcribers.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Continue.
Yes. And how did you conclude the meeting with Mr. Peter?
Well, for us, it was a very unfortunate situation because, you know, the relationship that we had with Transnet at the time was a very formal relationship of respect, I would say. Also, it was strange for us that Mr. Gary Peter himself will get involved in matters like this because Mr. Peter at the time was the procurement lead of Transnet. And the projects that we were doing were dealt with by the procurement leads of Transnet Capital Projects and not by Transnet themselves. So, you know, it was very bizarre for us to talk to the procurement lead of Transnet and not understanding why this project will receive such high attention.
Okay. And ultimately, did Hatch sign an agreement with either Mr. Dave Reddy or Mr. Padiachi for them to be part of the project?
No, we didn't.
Were any of those companies part of the project for phase 1?
No.
Okay. I'd like to take you to the approval of the Confinement Award, which is at HB 15, and that is on page 123. just for us to conclude this aspect of the SD partners.
Yeah.
Now, you will see that this is a memorandum to Mr. Brian Molefe, who at the time was the Group Chief Executive of Transnet, and it is from Mr. Charles Moeller, who was the Group Executive of Transnet Capital Projects, dated the 12th of November 2013, regarding the FEL4 EPCM services for Phase 1 of the Manganese 16 million tons per annum TFR project to Hatch Goba Confinement, and award status update for noting. On the following page, page 124, I'd just like us to deal with what is set out in paragraph 7 at the top of the page. If you can read that into the record and then also explain to us what this table is that we see here.
Must I read that for you?
Yes, paragraph 7.
Paragraph 7 states, further negotiations led by Mr. Gary Pita, Mr. G. Pita, Group Chief Supply Chain Officer, followed, wherein Transnet requirement that Hatch Goba subcontract 30% of the EPCM bid price to emerging black-owned companies was met by Hatch Goba on the 31st of October 2013 as follows. And then it's got a table with all the requirements and all the names of the companies.
And what were the name of the companies that Hatch had as their SD partners?
So there were 5 companies that were identified in our submission. The first company was Singh, which is a multidisciplinary engineering, consulting and project management company, 100% black-owned. And then the second company was EDS.
Sorry, Mr. Bester, sorry to interrupt you. The transcribers have asked if you could just move a bit away from the mic. It's affecting their transcribing. I apologize. Continue.
Apologies.
Continue.
The second company was EDS. EDS offers a unique combination of services designed to provide customized solutions to the renewable energy, mining and corporate sectors. The third company was MMQS, which is a quantity surveying and contract admin company. Let me just also say the second company, EDS, was 100% black-owned and 80% black woman-owned. The third company, as I said, was MMQS, which is a quantity surveying and contract admin company, 100% black-owned. The fourth company was ZD Projects, Engineering and Project Services, 100% black-owned and also 100% black woman-owned. And the fifth company was Aspire, which was also an engineering and project services company, 100% black-owned and 100% black woman-owned company.
Okay, and just to confirm, those were the companies that Hatch had selected to be its SD partners.
That's correct.
Okay, now if we can go back to your statement at page 41, still continuing with the SD partners that were part of the Hatch submission. At paragraph 44, at the end of the paragraph, you talk about the companies that were already included were Ascend, Aspire, EDS, and MMQS for phase 1. And I'd like us to go to the correspondence, which is HB 13, to be found on page 111 of the bundle. And at the foot of the page, if you can just tell us what this document is from Mr. Gray.
Yeah. It's an email from Mr. Greg Chu from Hatch to, I might not get this word right, yeah? So this is an email to Teboka Choko from Transnet Corporate, Komolemo Mashange, Zonyane Sidanyana, and also Mr. Vic Best. And I was copied in, Mr. Craig Simmer, Mr. Gary Pita, Tola Sitola, Alan Gray and Craig Sumption.
Okay. Now, if the subject says Hatch Goba responds to 6 November SD clarification request. If we can go to the next page, it would appear that what was being requested was for Hatch to be specific as to who the SD partners would be and what their role would be. I want to focus on what the response was from Mr. Tew of Hatch in respect of each one. You will see he says, name and address of proposed subconsultant, the nature and extent of the work or service, the previous experience with subconsultant, the BBBE level, and percentage black ownership. The first entity that he refers to is Assange, and if you look at the last line dealing with Assange before you see the number 2, he says, yes, we have worked with Assange on 2 projects, Maseroni and Transnet Energy Management Project. Do you see that?
That's correct,
And
yes.
then at the foot of the page, he deals with EDS. And he says the same on the next page, yes, we have worked with EDS on 4 projects. When we get to number 3, MMQS, he doesn't mention whether Hatch had previously worked with MMQS. And then ZD projects, he says, yes, we have worked with ZDP on various public infrastructure projects. And Aspire, he says, yes, we have worked with ZDP on various public infrastructure projects. Do you see that?
That's correct. I see it, yes.
My question is, how did MMQS become an SD partner of Hatch Consulting on this project?
I cannot recall 100% the details, but if I can recall to the best of my ability, MMQS was a quantity surveying company, and that was one of the requirements of the project, that quantity surveying skills be used, and there was a requirement for quantity surveyors to be used in the project to estimate as we go with the capital of the project to certain accuracies. That was a skill that Hatch didn't have at the time in South Africa. So I can only speculate at this stage that at the time MMQS would have come to us as one of the recommendations from one of the other SD partners. But I can clearly recall we did do a check and a background check on MMQS at the time. At the time, they did work a lot for Anglo-America, the Kumba iron ore mine at Sishen. And we did some background checks because we were also involved in some projects for Kumba at the time. And the quality of work and the references that we got back at the time was to our satisfaction. And for that reason, I think they were also included in the project.
Did you know anybody from MMQS?
I didn't personally know him, but the owner of the company was a person called Mantla. If I can recall, I can't recall his surname now. But over time, obviously working on the project, I became familiar with this person, Mantla, which was the owner of MMQS, yes.
And you personally didn't have any involvement in his appointment as a SD partner for Hatch?
No.
Did you have any involvement in the other SD partners' appointment?
No. I mean, the SD partners at the time, as I recall, obviously, as I said earlier in my statement, SD for us at Hatch and obviously for Transnet and South Africa, to be fair, was a new concept. So obviously, in our Monday meetings at the Hatch, this is a topic that we discussed about projects that other directorates within Hatch would have done, like energy, mining, etc. And there would have been a sharing of information about companies which we could consider for instance, Manganese Phase 1. And I would assume at that meetings it was to cite most of these companies where the names came out from other projects that we were doing with them, as can be seen from this email from Mr. Greg Tew.
Okay. Chair, you would remember that at the beginning I indicated that I would be referring to 2 other statements. I beg leave to refer to one of those statements now, which is in bundle 4B.
Okay.
Mr. Bester, can you please go to bundle 4B? Chair, this statement was supplemented yesterday, if I understand, into the bundle.
Whose statement is it?
It is for Mr. Gerard Bierman.
Okay,
It
all right.
is BB21. It's the last folder in 4B.
Tell him the page number.
The page number, Chair, is page 921.
Excuse me?
Page 921. Do you have it? Sorry,
This
Chair.
is this the statement of a witness who is going to give evidence in due course or not?
Chair, it is a witness that has submitted a statement. He is available to give evidence, but he is currently located in...
Just raise your voice.
Sorry, Chair. He is currently located in Australia. So we do not foresee that he'll give evidence anytime soon, but he is available to give evidence and has submitted the statement.
Yes, okay. Let's admit the statement for now, provisionally.
I'm
And
indebted to you,
then
Chair.
in due course, we can see whether it should be admitted finally, but there should be no problem with that.
Thank you, Chair. With your
Yes.
leave, Chair, may it be admitted page 921 to page 96.
I think your voice is competing with the aircon,
I'll raise my voice, Chair.
but I don't want everybody to, if it's hot, I don't want everybody not to have maybe if you raise the,
I will, Chair. Is that better?
raise your voice.
Okay.
Maybe it's fine. If it's possible for the aircon not to make as much noise as it does while still on, that would be helpful. Okay, you'd like me to provisionally admit this affidavit by a statement by Mr. Gerard Bierman as exhibit
BB21, Chair.
The statement by Mr. Gerard Bierman is provisionally admitted as an exhibit and will be marked exhibit BB21.
Yes, indeed, Chair. BB21.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you,
It
Chair.
starts at page 923.
Indeed,
Okay,
Chair.
all right.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Bester, this is a statement that was prepared by Mr. Gerard Bierman, who's the former Chief Financial Officer of Transnet Capital Projects. And you will remember you had given evidence about what Mr. Basson told you about a discussion he had with Mr. Bierman and Mr. Singh.
That's correct.
Okay. At paragraph 15, I think we should start at paragraph 14 of the statement on page 926. I want to read to you what Mr. Bierman says about the meeting that he had with Mr. Basson and Singh. He says at paragraph 14, on or about 15 July 2013, during the period leading up to the final approval, in one of many internal review sessions where I was present, Singh, and he's referring to Mr. Anoj Singh, requested that a company known as DEC Engineering be profiled for capacity and skills. He also made a request for DEC to be a designated subcontractor on phase 1. I considered this request highly inappropriate for various reasons. 14.1, I had never heard of DEC. 14.2, it was inappropriate for Transnet to impose a subcontractor on the principal contractor, which would have been Hatch in this instance. 14.3, if Transnet could impose a subcontractor, it should be done by way of a competitive and fair process where other potential subcontractors would also be considered. And 14.4, in order for a subcontractor to be considered for a project of this magnitude, it would have to have a proven track record within the rail industry, and in particular in respect of railway tracks. The fact that I had never heard of DEC was a clear indication to me that they were not experienced in railway tracks and certainly didn't have a proven record. Now, at paragraph 16, we'll skip 15. At paragraph 16, he says, Singh also asked Basson to consider MMQS as a designated subcontractor. Singh told Basson to obtain a copy of an introduction presentation from MMQS, which Basson subsequently obtained. This presentation outlined the skills and capacities of MMQS. And then if we go to paragraph 19 on page 928, he speaks about his response that he gave. Sorry, Chair.
Maybe you should, by the time you ask him to comment, he might have forgotten some of the things that you should ask him in manageable proportions.
Yes.
Take one at a time.
Okay. Chair, my question really relates to just to identify to him that MMQS was one of the entities that Singh also asked to be part of the SD program, which Mr. Bester wouldn't know about, but I just want to show him the link between MMQS on their final SD list and the request that was made by Mr. Singh in that meeting.
But what are you going to ask him to do about it?
Yes, just for him to acknowledge that this is what Mr. Bierman says about MMQS. Insofar as there was a request by Mr. Singh for MMQS to also be included.
Did Mr. Bierman talk to him about this?
No, Chair.
Yes.
It's in relation to, Chair would remember that MMQS now ends up as an SD partner of Hatch. Mr. Bester says he doesn't know how they were appointed, even though they had never done work with them.
Are you going to ask him to comment on it?
Yes, Chair.
Well, just tell him what Mr. Bierman says,
Okay.
the gist,
Yes.
and then ask him whether he's able to comment on that.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't have to
Okay,
read the
insofar.
whole thing.
Thank you, Chair. Insofar as paragraph 14 is concerned, on page 926 that I had read into the record, were you aware that, and paragraph 16, that Mr. Singh had also asked Mr. Basson and Mr. Bierman to have MMQS profiled for purposes of being an SD partner on the project?
No, I was not aware.
Okay. And you indicated that you didn't know how MMQS came to be an SD partner for Hatch.
Yes. I can only speculate that being the specific skill that they had of quantity surveying, that might have come through one of the other SD partners that we had. That's only my speculation.
Well, insofar as there was a prior request by Mr. Singh, and MMQS then ends up being an SD partner of Hatch, do you find it to be coincidental, or since you were not involved in the appointment of MMQS, that there are people within Hatch who would know how MMQS, an entity they had never worked with before, became a partner?
I'm not sure what you want me to answer, but I would say it's very coincidental, yes. And I don't know the details.
And had you ever been approached by anybody about MMQS being an SD partner in the same way that you were approached by Padiachi and Singh before the confinement award?
No, I have not been approached, no.
And now that you know that there was this prior request from Mr. Singh, what is your comment insofar as MMQS is concerned, being an SD partner of Hatch on phase 1?
Well, now that I have seen the details and heard the details, and unfortunately it's a long time ago, but I remember that there were discussions with MMQS afterwards about other projects in Transnet where the gentleman and the owner of MMQS at the time did have a lot of information about Transnet and their projects, yes.
And when you say had discussions about the projects, what do you mean by that?
As I said, unfortunately, I can't remember the detail as it was a very long time ago, but I remember subsequent to the Manganese project, there would have been other projects. Obviously now, having concluded the phase 1 project and being part of the project, these companies like MMQS obviously would have been now in contact with us at Hatch for future work at Transnet or other state-owned companies. And I can recall there were some discussions with the owner of MMQS where he indicated future projects coming up from Transnet and the budgets and the detail which was discussed with us. Yes, so that is a coincidence.
That is a?
A coincidence.
Okay. Now, what was your experience of MMQS on the phase 1?
Well, I can tell you, MMQS, as with all the other SD companies, if you know Hatch, I mean, they were controlled. Companies were appointed in a very controlled manner, where we as Hatch would have had full control of the type of work that they do, the quality of work, and of course the invoicing. If you understand the systems within Hatch, it's a project management company with systems set up to measure progress, actual progress and time spent on project, you know, so there is no deviation from, let's say, the truth. So my experience with all the companies that we actually then used on phase 1 was that it was a good performance and in line with the Hatch expectations.
Okay. Can we then now move on to phase 2, which starts on
The
page
other file.
43 of your statement?
Page?
43. And that is in 4A. My apologies.
You said 43?
Page 43, Chair.
Okay.
Yep.
Paragraph 52.
We are now back in the
Bundle 4A.
bundle 4.
4A, yes, Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Bester, can you tell us what transpired and how phase 2 came about, and then what transpired during the phase 2 procurement process?
Yes. So if you can recall where I started off my statement is that we always knew that there was going to be a phase 2, a much bigger project than phase 1. And then phase 2 was a competitive bidding process, international, that was advertised in the newspapers by Transnet, meaning that any international company that complied with the requirements as set out in the tenders could basically tender. So we always knew there was an opportunity for us then to tender on phase 2.
Okay, and so you did tender on phase 2, and at page 44 of your statement, at paragraph 54, you speak of you making contact with Mr. Reddy prior to Transnet advertising the tender for phase 2. Can you tell us why you made contact with Mr. Reddy and what transpired?
Yeah, so it was during that time, and the time frame would have been a few months, if I can recall, but on every Monday, we would have had within HATS a weekly meeting where we discussed the clients and the progress on projects, and we had a review of each and every project. And one of the things that was discussed at this specific meeting, I recall, was that we were also involved with other Transnet projects, and one of the other projects was the National Multi-Product Pipeline Project of Transnet, where Transnet did not pay our invoices. It was a big problem for HATS because I can't remember the detail of the quantum of the invoices, but it was a lot of million rands that would have been outstanding for months, which was not obviously unacceptable. So I recall at the meeting there were comments made by our Chief Financial Officer and our management team that, you know, we need to try to get to Mr. Singh and have a meeting with him to discuss our options, because contractually one of the options that we had was just to stop work, something that we don't like doing because it can cause a lot of damage and harm to clients in the projects. Other options would have been just to charge interest on outstanding invoices, which is just another invoice that will collect outstanding days. Or we need to have a meeting with him and understand exactly what is the problem with Transnet, why they do not pay our invoices. So we were talking and debating options of getting access to Mr. Singh. As it was mentioned at the meeting that various emails have been sent to colleagues within Transnet requesting to have a meeting with Mr. Singh, or there would have been emails directly sent to Mr. Singh asking for a meeting to talk about the outstanding invoices. So it was at one of these meetings that I made a suggestion, I think at the time, why don't we speak to Mr. Dave Reddy, because he seemed to have access to Mr. Singh, and ask him to arrange a meeting with Mr. Singh so we can have a discussion about our outstanding invoices.
The outstanding invoices, did they relate to phase 1 or did they relate to phase 2?
Chair, that relates to other projects that we were doing for Transnet at the time.
Okay.
As I indicated, that specific project was called the NMPP, which was a major project of Transnet where HATS also had a role and did invoices every month.
By this time, what had been finalized? Was it the award of phase 1, of the phase 1 project to you, or was the actual work finalized for phase 2?
By that time, phase 1 was already awarded and we were already busy with the project in the execution.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just trying to understand what gave you the impression that Mr. Reddy would have access to Mr. Singh in order for him to arrange this meeting?
Well, from the various meetings I had with Mr. Reddy at the time, you know, where he loosely mentioned number 1, and he also spoke about Mr. Singh, it did give us the impression that he somehow knows Mr. Singh and that he have access to him.
Okay, and what was Mr. Reddy's response to your request for him to set up the meeting?
I recall he said to me, no problem, I will arrange a meeting for you. And I think it was almost, I can't remember the time frame, but let's say it was almost within the next day, he said to me, Mr. Singh said he will see you.
And did that meeting happen?
Yes, that meeting happened. Yes, it was arranged for, I didn't have, or we didn't have access to Mr. Singh directly. So Mr. Reddy indicated Mr. Singh said he will see us in a restaurant in Melrose Arch.
Do you remember how long after he said to you, the meeting is good to go, that the actual meeting actually took place?
It was very quick. I can't remember the detail, but let's say it was 1 or 2 days.
Okay. So again, you go to the meeting, who was present, what transpired, what was discussed, what was the conclusion of the meeting?
Yes. So now you must remember this wasn't actually my meeting. This was a meeting that came about from the management of HATS, and most specifically from the Chief Financial Officer of HATS to talk about the outstanding invoice and why Transnet is not paying us. So I went to the meeting. At the time, we decided that from Hatch, it would be myself, being just a representative for rail. It would be our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Craig Sumption, and it would be one of the senior engineers from infrastructure, Mr. Craig Simmer. So we decided we all three would go to the meeting. I remember I went on my own, and it was agreed that I will meet the other gentleman there in front of the restaurant at a certain time, as agreed, to meet Mr. Singh.
Okay, and what transpired?
So on that specific day of the meeting, I remember I arrived a little bit early at the restaurant, purely because I wasn't sure where the restaurant was, and I need to just make sure I've got enough time to find it. And as I walked towards the restaurant, I was met by a gentleman who stopped there and started talking to me. So the gentleman introduced himself as Mr. Salim Essa. You know, I can recall it because I didn't know who he was. I remember the discussion. I asked him, who are you? He said, I'm just somebody. I'm here to talk to you. I said, no, we have a meeting with Mr. Anos Singh. He said, yes. He will call Mr. Singh when he's ready and when we're ready. He just want to make sure everything is okay. So it was a very strange. I asked him, so what is your business? What are you doing? He said, I mustn't worry about that. He's got lots of odd businesses. But he's here to attend the meeting. I must also say the other thing that struck me at the time was, you know, his dress code. He was wearing an old jean and looked like he was sleeping in the street somewhere. So I was not impressed.
Okay, and did he explain why he was at a meeting that was essentially a Transnet meeting?
At the time, I didn't explain, but it sort of unfolded in front of me because it was clear that he was in control of the situation or in control of this meeting. He said to me, wait here, outside the restaurant. He walked in. I was standing outside looking inside. And he was walking in as if he wants to make sure everything is okay inside the restaurant. You know, he was walking around. It was strange. It was almost as if he wants to make sure everything is safe for us to go inside, everything is set up and arranged. He came outside and I said, I'm waiting for Anos. He said, I will now call Anos. And he was talking on his phone and it was literally a few seconds later and Anos arrived. So, very strange.
Okay, now you say in your statement, if you look at paragraph 58, maybe just as guidance, if you can take us through what was discussed at the meeting itself.
So by that time, my other two colleagues also arrived. We walked inside. It was a very strange meeting, you know, because we were now not sure what's happening, because we actually had the meeting with Mr. Anos Singh. He was dressed as usual, to the teeth with his suit and tie. And this gentleman, Mr. Salim Essa, sitting there doing most of the talking. And we listening. So it was a very superficial meeting. Nothing was said, really. It was talking about nothing. And, you know, I can remember my feeling was I just want to get this meeting over and leave because we're not achieving anything. Anos, I remember, said a few words. It would not have been any comfort to us. No commitments were given of invoices. And, you know, I think we all left the meeting not knowing exactly what happened.
Did you ultimately get a chance to tell Mr. Singh what your complaint was, namely your invoices were not being paid and
Yes.
It was taking, the delays were too long, contrary to the agreement. Did you get a chance to actually say this is why we wanted a meeting with you, Mr. Singh?
Yes, Chair, I have to tell you that this was a very strange meeting, as I said, because Mr. Singh was sitting there as if he was on a leash, so to say. We started off the meeting by saying to him exactly why we asked for this meeting, because of the amount of money that was owed to us, and what it cost us, what our options are. And, you know, I clearly remember the answer that he gave us was, it didn't give us any comfort that he was actually addressing our concerns. And all three of us from Hatch side clearly wanted to leave this meeting because, you know, I think we saw that we're not going to achieve something. Plus, the presence of Mr. Salim Essa was for us something that we couldn't understand.
And at that stage, or at any stage, or did you at any stage during the meeting come to understand what Mr. Salim Essa's role was in relation to Transnet matters?
Not at all. It was, in fact, a very quick meeting. We were sitting at a dinner table, a lunch table in the restaurant. Our plan was actually to have lunch with Mr. Singh, but as it unfolded, unknowingly we decided not to have lunch. Mr. Singh didn't, as I said, Mr. Singh didn't give us any comfort. I could not even remember what Mr. Essa was talking to us about, but it was a very short meeting, and then we said thank you and we left.
Was there somebody who was like chairing this meeting?
Just come again, Mr. Chair.
Was there somebody who seemed like chairing this meeting?
Mr. Salim Essa was in charge of this meeting, it seemed to us, yes.
Yeah, okay, all right. What was the name of the restaurant in which you were? Can you remember? Or is it mentioned in your
I can't
statement?
remember if I can see the name.
Chair,
Or
it's not...
JP?
It's,
Or JNP?
no, Chair, it's not mentioned at this meeting. There's a subsequent meeting
Or there's
that
another
was at
meeting?
JB.
Oh,
Okay.
all right. Okay, you can't remember the name.
I know the location in my head, but I can't recall the name. I
Yes.
apologize for that,
Okay,
Chair.
all right. Okay, continue.
Thank you, Chair. Now, what was your impression of Mr. Issa and Mr. Singh's relationship at this meeting?
It was the most bizarre introduction, I would say. You must also recall that this is the first time that I actually had the privilege to be with Mr. Singh in a meeting situation, because he was just a name that mentioned to us, and it was just a name thrown around. Previously, we were supposed to have a meeting with him, which Mr. Pita chaired, and he didn't even pitch. So, you know, so I had for me, in my head, it was an anticlimax, because Mr. Singh was sitting there, as I said, very well dressed in a suit and tie, and Mr. Essa was controlling him, and you know, he was sitting there as if he can, almost as if he can only talk to us when he's allowed to talk. It was very strange.
Did you get the impression that there was some subtle message that was being sent to Hatch in one way or another? One, by the delay in paying the invoices, and two, by the way this meeting was being handled? And if so, what was the impression, or your impression of what message was being sent? Or is that something
Chair,
that you didn't get
I can
the chance
only
to
speculate,
analyze?
but so afterwards we had a meeting within Hatch to now debrief ourselves about this meeting. And I think the conclusion was that we were very confused about the presence of this gentleman, Mr. Salim Essa, which I also met for the first time and didn't know from a bar of soap. What also confused us a lot was his dress code, which was very funny, as I said previously, and he didn't have the sort of it didn't look like he sort of fitted into that discussion. And we were confused about what message it actually was now going to be conveyed to us as HATS people.
But in terms of what Mr. Singh said, are you able to remember whatever it is he said, to say, well, during the meeting, this is what he said? Is there anything that you remember quite well that he said?
Yes, I can recall some information. It was about Transnet embarking on this major projects. The importance of supplier development, and there was a perception at Transnet at the time that we didn't agree with supplier development, that HATS had a resistance to supplier development, which was not the case. It was how the supplier development was introduced to us by other individuals. So it was what we thought it was to tell us that we need to accept this supplier development, and this is going to be a major thing going forward for Transnet.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Bester, on page 46 of your statement, at paragraph 59, you then speak of a call that you received from Mr. Reddy soon after this meeting. Can you tell us about this call and what transpired thereafter?
Yes, so not long after this meeting that we had with Mr. Singh and Mr. Esa in Melrose Arch, I got a call from Mr. Reddy informing me that Mr. Esa would like to see me again as a follow-up meeting to the meeting that we had, if you can call it a meeting, which I discussed with Mr. Alan Gray and Mr. Craig Sumption of HATS at the time. And it was agreed that I would like, or that I can attend the meeting just to listen what this gentleman was going to tell me, because as I said, at the time we had absolutely zero knowledge about this individual, his role. All we knew is that it was a strange relationship with Transnet, but it was agreed that no harm in just going to listen to what he was going to say.
And do you remember when this meeting was?
I cannot remember exactly the exact date, but I can remember exactly where the meeting was set up. It was also in Melrose Arch, at the restaurant. If I can recall, the restaurant's name was JB's Corner, I think.
Okay. I just want to focus on trying to pin down an approximate date of this meeting. If you go, you say that soon after this meeting, which was the initial meeting, and the initial meeting you said happened before Transnet advertised the phase 2 tender. And if you look at page 43, at paragraph 53, we see that Transnet advertised the tender on the 24th of April 2014. Now, would this meeting have been after the advertisement?
From what I recall, definitely this meeting was after the tender was advertised, yes.
Okay, so it would have been after April 2014.
Yes.
Okay, continue.
So this meeting was set up at, and by the way, I got notice of this meeting or request for this meeting through Mr. Dave Reddy, who phoned me and said that Mr. Salim Esa would like to see me as a follow-up. And it was at a certain time and date was set, and I went to this meeting at this location in Melrose Arch, where I was met by Mr. Dave Reddy and Mr. Salim Esa.
Was there anybody else in attendance?
No. Again, it was just a little bit of a funny setup. I went into the restaurant and everybody knew Mr. Salim Esa. You know, he was like a celebrity. Everybody greeting him. There was a table set out for us on the stage, if I can recall. So it was only the three of us.
Okay, and what transpired at that meeting? What was being discussed?
It was again a very irritating meeting for me personally because Mr. Essa had a lot of cell phones with him. It was ringing the whole time and he was talking and standing up and walking around and I was sitting there very irritated, I remember. But when he was sitting down, he told me that we need to include him in our phase 2 tender for the manganese. And he was talking about, I recall asking him, and what are you going to do? And I remember recalling, he told me, I mustn't worry about that. I must just include his company. He will give me the name. And from what I can recall, he also told me that I need to include him for 80 million rand. To which I laughed or told him something that it's ridiculous. I told him about it's a competitive process. I know exactly what the budgets and affordability of the project is. How tight the budgets are, the business case that we've done, and there is no room for errors to be made in the money. And he just laughed at me. He said, "Don't you worry. You include me for 80 million, and I will grow that." To something ridiculous, I can recall over 300 million rand, and he was loosely talking to me about money. Also, when I spoke to him about the budget for the project, he said to me, "I don't know what I'm talking about." He knows what the budget is, and he will decide what the budget is going to be and where the project will end up. And I basically know nothing.
This was Mr. Esther said this.
That's correct.
Now, when he talked about you including his company, was he talking about his company separate from Mr. Reddy's company and Mr.
Yes.
Dachi's company?
Yes.
Was it a different entity?
Yes, it was. He made it clear to me that it is his company. He will give me the name. There's various companies to choose from. And I mustn't worry about what they're going to do. I must just invoice.
Oh, okay. And Mr. Reddy was there?
Mr. Reddy was there. He didn't say a word. He was just listening.
Yes. Okay, all right.
Now, if we can just go to your statement, because this is a very important meeting, and I just want you to set out the full contents of what transpired. At paragraph 63, you say that, which is on page 46 of your statement, you say that, this is now Mr. Issa, he insisted that we should include his company and said that they have a lot of power. When did he say this during the meeting?
It would have been at the time when I told him he doesn't know what he's talking about. And he was now trying to tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about.
And did he say who this they was that he was referring to?
He didn't go into the detail, but he said to me, I mustn't worry about the detail about budgets. I recall, for instance, he told me that they have already decided who's going to be the next CEO of Eskom. And I will clearly see it when it happens, that what the power is that they have and how they make decisions, if I don't believe him.
And who did he say that person would be?
He said they decided Mr. Brian Molefe will be the CEO of Eskom.
And this was all during that meeting?
That's correct.
Okay, now this...
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Chair.
This would have been after April 2014, you said? Did you say this meeting would have taken place after April 2014, Mr. Bester?
That's correct, yes.
Wasn't Mr. Brian Molefe already Group CEO of Transnet at that time?
He said Eskom, Chair. He said Eskom, that Mr.
Oh, Eskom.
Eskom.
Or he
Yes.
said they already knew who was going to
So
be.
at that time, if I can recall, Mr. Brian Molefe was the CEO of Transnet
At the time of the meeting.
at the time of the meeting.
Yeah, but what was the remark that Mr. Salome Essa said about Group CEO or something?
He was convincing me that I don't know what I'm talking about, and he was trying to indicate the power that they have. If I can recall at the time, I couldn't recall the situation at Eskom, but he said to me, you will see, we've already decided that Mr. Brian Molefe will be the next CEO of Eskom. And when it gets announced, you will see the power that we have.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Now, the 80 million rand that he initially spoke about, was that part of the SD component, or would it be over and above the SD component, according to your understanding?
Well, so his indication was that we need to include the 80 million as part of the SD, but when I asked him what he's going to do for the 80 million,
I'm sorry.
My apologies, Chair.
Well, I've been sitting here listening to evidence from different work streams, so I'm just thinking about this evidence that you are giving,
No problem, Chair.
because Mr. Brian Molefe ended up being seconded to Eskom. Was it 2015, 2014? Well, I was hearing this evidence 2 weeks ago and so on. So I'm just wondering, Mr. Essa knows sometime while Mr. Brian Molefe is at Transnet that Mr. Brian Molefe is going to end up being CEO of Eskom. And he's mentioning this to you kind of in passing and just to show you that he and whoever he was talking about have a lot
That's
of
correct.
power.
That's
have a lot
correct.
of power. And we all know that ultimately Mr. Molefe did end up being Group CEO of Eskom.
that's correct.
Yes.
He also mentioned to me, if I can say, at the meeting
Yes.
that with the power that they have, they can do anything. Because I
Yes.
told him that we are going to tender for this project. It's a competitive bidding process, so each and every cent counts. And he said to me, no, it's not the case. If I or Hatch at that stage include him in our submission, they can change all the prices, they will make sure we get the job, they will grow the budgets, and they're in control.
That's what he said.
That's correct.
Yes. Yes, continue.
Thank you, Chair. On the 80 million that you were referring to, you say he then said it was going to increase to 350 million and then eventually to 2 billion. Was this in relation to phase 2 or the entire project, the entire MEP?
So let me explain this to you. So this specifically relates to phase 2. So his 80 million that he referred to was what he wanted, or his company. And if I recall at the meeting, he said over time, he will make sure that they grow the 80 million to something like 350 million rand, which was part of the SD, let's say, services. But the overall budget of the project at the time for, let's call it the engineering, procurement, construction management, as we refer to it, EPCM, was something like just over 1 billion rand. And he mentioned to me, they've already decided that they're going to grow that amount to over 2 billion rand.
So they would double it
Yes,
for the entire project, the entire.
that's correct. So obviously they had other plans as well outside the 80 million that he was talking about.
And what was,
I'm sorry, at that stage, what was your reaction to what this man was saying to you, which, if true, would show him to have quite some very strong power?
Chair, I was disappointed and shocked. So I told him I didn't say he's an idiot, but I said to him he doesn't know what he's talking about. And
Yes.
I know what's going on in the project, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yes. Okay.
and just to put the 2 billion in context, at that stage, what was Hatch's proposal on phase 2?
Our phase 2 overall submission, I think, was just over 800 million.
Okay. And do you know what it would have been in respect of, is that for rail and port on phase 2?
Just the rail.
Just for rail and
Just
on port?
If I can recall, the budget for the port was something in the region of 750 million, if I can recall.
Okay. Now, what did you do after that meeting, this jarring meeting that you had attended?
Well, I left the meeting, obviously shocked. Went back to Hatch and I informed the management of Hatch of the meeting that transpired. That would have been my immediate supervisor, Mr. Alan Gray at the time, Mr. Craig Sampson, which was our financial officer in infrastructure. And then we also went to see our managing director, Mr. Rory Kirk.
Okay, and what was it decided what would Hatch's approach be to this matter?
Well, it was important, obviously, that we share this information with whoever in Hatch, our management in Canada, CEO as well. So that information was also shared with our legal counsel, which suggested everything that happened and transpired must be in the form of an affidavit and filed with our auditors. And then we also informed Transnet, and that would have been Mrs. Deidre Strydom at the time.
Okay, and did you get any responses from them? What were their reactions to you reporting this to them?
At the time, I cannot recall the detail. For our reporting to Transnet, it was, thank you for the reporting, and I remember the feedback from Mrs. Strydom at the time was they will continue to look for avenues for us to share this information in the bigger Transnet, but we should be careful to whom we share this information with.
Did you follow that advice of Hatch's counsel of deposing to an affidavit?
Yes. So, Chair, I did a complete affidavit.
Yes, which detailed what had been.
If I recall the details, it would have been filed with Ernst & Young,
Yes.
our auditors at the time.
Yes, but it recorded what had transpired at that meeting, is that right?
So what I went to the office, I did a complete affidavit, which I shared with our legal counsel, and everybody had their input that information, and from the previous meeting with Mr. Arnold Singh, Salim Essa. And we were looking at our legal counsel to ensure that, the information, everything is above board for future purposes if it might be required in future. So that was the advice that we got.
Yes, but what I'm interested in is whether if one were to find that affidavit, and I don't know if it is here,
No.
if one were to find that affidavit, it would corroborate what you have told me in terms of what was discussed or what was said by Mr. Essa at that meeting.
Chair, if I can recall, and my understanding is that there was a request put to Hatch to get that copy of that affidavit and the information. I'm not sure if a copy could have been obtained.
Do you know what the position is?
Yes, Chair, the affidavit wasn't finalized and was never filed with Ernst & Young. That was the information that the Commission's investigators received from Hatch when they inquired about the affidavit. It was in draft form and never finalized and filed.
Is that your recollection, Mr. Bester, that you never signed the affidavit? Or could that be a mistake?
I wouldn't have had insight into that type of information. For me, I would have submitted that information to our legal counsel and then they would take care of it.
Yeah, no, but an affidavit, ultimately, you have to sign.
I've signed my affidavit.
You did
signed.
sign it?
Yes.
Yes. So I think that somebody needs to follow up. Maybe there is some misunderstanding.
We will, Chair. We'll
Yeah,
get the investigators
because
to follow up.
It would be important. That was an affidavit that was signed while everything was fresh, I guess, in your mind. Is that correct?
That's right, that's correct.
Yes. Do you have a recollection of how long after this meeting you may have signed this affidavit, or you might not be able to say? A few days, a few weeks, some
Chair, I
months?
think it was a very urgent matter for us. It would have been
Yes.
in that week
few
at
days,
most
yeah.
after the
Yes.
event that we've formalized
Yes.
this affidavit.
Okay, all right. If there is a way in which you can assist and facilitate obtaining that affidavit, that would be appreciated, Mr. Bester. Okay, all right.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I see that it's 1 o'clock. Is this an opportune time to take the lunch
Yes,
agenda?
let's take the lunch break. We'll resume at 2 o'clock.
Thank you, Chair.
We adjourn.